My name is Zethka, and I'm what your species might call a galactic observer. For 3,000 cycles, I have traveled between star systems, documenting the rise and fall of civilizations. I have seen empires that spanned entire sectors crumble in mere decades. I have witnessed species achieve technological transcendence only to destroy themselves with their own creations. Nothing in the galaxy surprises me anymore, or so I thought until I encountered humanity. The first time I heard about humans was in a dingy cantina on Proxima Station. A Kelvari trader, his blue scales dulled with age and fear, was rambling to anyone who would listen about some new species that had emerged from the Outer Rim territories. "They're insane," he kept saying, his voice trembling. "Completely insane. They don't follow any of the established protocols for first contact. They don't respect the natural order of things." I barely paid attention at first. Every few cycles, some new species discovered faster than light travel and stumbled into galactic society. Most learned their place quickly enough when they encountered the established powers. The Thessian Empire had ruled the core worlds for millennia. The Machine Collective controlled the industrial sectors. The Psionic Consortium held dominion over the psychic realms. Everyone knew their role, but the trader's next words caught my attention. "They rescued a Thessian research vessel," he whispered. "Just rescue them. For nothing. No payment, no territorial gain, no strategic advantage." When the Thexians asked why, the humans just said it was the right thing to do. That was impossible. In galactic society, nothing happened without calculation. Every action had a price, every gesture an ulterior motive. Altruism was a fairy tale that parents told their offspring before teaching them the harsh realities of survival among the stars. I decided to investigate. My first stop was the neutral zone, where most first contacts occurred. The local administrator, a bureaucratic Zentoran with 4 arms and an impressive collection of stamps, pulled up the human files with visible confusion. "Strange species," he admitted, his 4 hands shuffling through holographic documents. They submitted all the proper paperwork for galactic citizenship, but they did it wrong. Instead of claiming territory or demanding resources, they offered to share their technology. For free. He showed me their initial communication. It was a simple message broadcast on all standard frequencies. "Greetings from the people of Earth. We come in peace and friendship, hoping to learn from you and share what we have learned. We believe that all sentient beings deserve respect and dignity, regardless of their origin or capabilities." I laughed. Actually laughed. It was so naive, so impossibly idealistic. They would learn better soon enough. The administrator continued. "They've been sending aid ships to disaster zones without being asked. They've shared medical technology with species they've never even met. And when the Thessian Empire demanded tribute for protection, they politely declined and offered to help patrol the trade routes instead. What do the Thexians do? Nothing, so far. That's what's strange. Usually, they would have sent a battle fleet to teach the newcomers respect. But something about the humans has them cautious. That piqued my curiosity further. The Thessian Empire had conquered dozens of species. Their military might was legendary, their tactics ruthless. What could possibly make them hesitate against a species that had only recently achieved interstellar travel? I booked passage on a freight hauler heading toward human space. The journey took 2 weeks, during which I spoke with other passengers about these mysterious newcomers. The stories I heard defied belief. A Verlani merchant told me about a human trade delegation that had negotiated a deal where both sides profited equally. "Unheard of," she said. "In my 300 years of trading, no one has ever offered me a fair deal on the first negotiation. They could have demanded better terms, but they insisted on what they called mutual benefit." A Quellian doctor shared an even stranger tale. "They sent medical supplies to treat the Corvin plague," he said. "The Corvins had nothing to offer in return, no strategic value whatsoever. When I asked the human medical team why they came, they said they couldn't stand by while people suffered. They saved 17 million lives and asked for nothing." Each story was more unbelievable than the last. humans helping refugees without checking their species or political affiliations. Human engineers fixing infrastructure on worlds they had no claim to. Human scientists sharing research that could have given them significant advantages in trade negotiations. It went against every principle of galactic civilization. It was inefficient, illogical, and potentially dangerous. So why did every being who had encountered humans speak of them with a mixture of confusion and, was that respect? I finally reached the edge of human space after 3 weeks of travel. The first thing I noticed was the lack of military checkpoints. Most species fortified their borders heavily, demanding identification, purpose of visit, and usually a significant bribe for safe passage. The human border station was different. It was a converted civilian vessel with clear markings identifying it as a peaceful contact point. When I transmitted my request to enter their space, the response came within minutes. "Welcome, traveler. Please proceed to Docking Bay 7. A representative will meet you to assist with any needs you might have during your visit. No interrogation. No demands for credentials. No suspicious scanning of my vessel for weapons or contraband. They simply welcome me." The representative who met me was my first direct encounter with a human. She was smaller than most galactic species I had met, with pale skin and brown hair tied back in a practical style. Her clothing was simple but clean, and she carried herself with a confidence that didn't seem to come from military training or political power. "I'm Sarah Chun," she said, extending her hand in what I later learned was a human greeting gesture. "I understand you're a galactic observer? That's fascinating. We'd love to learn more about your experiences with other civilizations." She was genuinely interested in my work, asking thoughtful questions about the species I'd studied. Most beings I encountered saw my role as either useful for intelligence gathering or completely irrelevant. Sarah seemed to view it as inherently valuable. "We're still so new to all this," she admitted as she showed me to the guest quarters they had prepared. "We want to learn as much as we can about how to be good neighbors in the galaxy." Good neighbors. Another alien concept. In space, you were either strong enough to survive or weak enough to be absorbed by someone stronger. Neighborliness was a luxury for species that didn't understand the harsh realities of cosmic politics. But as I settled into the surprisingly comfortable quarters, I found myself curious about these humans and their strange philosophy. Tomorrow, I would begin my formal observation period. What I learned would challenge everything I thought I knew about civilization, survival, and what it truly meant to be sentient. Little did I know that within a week, I would witness something that would shake the entire galactic order to its foundations. Something that would finally explain why even the mighty Decian Empire had learned to fear a species that seemed to value kindness above conquest. The humans were about to show me what they called courage. And once I saw it in action, I would understand why the stars themselves trembled at the sound of their battle cry. My second day in human space began with what they called breakfast. Sarah had invited me to join her in the station's common area, where humans gathered to share their morning meal. I expected a formal diplomatic affair, but instead found myself in a relaxed environment where humans talked freely about their lives, their work, and their concerns. We heard there might be trouble brewing in the outer colonies. One of the humans mentioned between bites of something they called coffee cake. The Void Hunters have been more active lately. The Void Hunters. Even I, with all my experience across the galaxy, felt a chill at that name. They were an ancient species that had long ago abandoned their physical forms, existing as pure malevolent energy that fed on the suffering of other beings. They appeared without warning, consumed entire populations, and left nothing but dead worlds in their wake. Most civilizations had learned to hide when the Void Hunters emerged from whatever dark corner of space they called home. The lucky ones evacuated their outer colonies at the first sign of their approach. The unlucky ones simply disappeared from galactic records. The outer colonies have about 2 million beings from 14 different species, Sarah said, her expression growing serious. If the Void Hunters are really heading that way, most of those people won't have the ships to evacuate in time. What do the colonial governments plan to do? I asked. They've already started pulling back their fleets to protect the core worlds, another human replied. Standard procedure when facing the Void Hunters. Save what you can and abandon the rest. I nodded. It was the logical response, the one that had allowed galactic civilization to survive previous Void Hunter incursions. You couldn't fight them directly, so you minimized losses and waited for them to move on to easier prey. But the humans around the table were looking at each other with expressions I couldn't quite read. Finally, Sarah spoke up. Admiral Torres called a fleet assembly for this afternoon. She wants to discuss our response options. Response options? I was confused. What response options? The Void Hunters can't be fought. Every species knows that. The humans exchanged glances again. One of them, a young male with calloused hands that spoke of manual labor, leaned forward. With respect, Zethka, maybe that's because no one's ever really tried. The casual way he dismissed thousands of years of galactic military doctrine should have been amusing. Instead, something in his tone sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. These humans weren't joking or boasting. They were discussing the possibility of actually fighting the Void Hunters as if it were a reasonable strategic option. The fleet assembly that afternoon drew hundreds of humans from across their space. I observed from the gallery as Admiral Torres, a stern woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold decades of hard decisions, addressed the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, we've received confirmed reports that the Void Hunters are moving toward the outer colonies. Intelligence estimates they'll reach the first inhabited systems in 6 days. A murmur ran through the audience, but it wasn't the sound of panic I would have expected from any other species facing this news. It was the sound of people mentally preparing for action. The colonial governments have begun evacuating their core populations, but transport capacity is limited. Current projections suggest that approximately 60% of the colonial population will still be in harm's way when the Void Hunters arrive. She paused, letting that sink in. Over 1 million beings were going to die, and everyone in that room knew it. I've spoken with representatives from the Visian Empire, the Machine Collective, and the Psionic Consortium. All three powers have confirmed they will not commit forces to defend the colonies. They consider the colonies an acceptable loss to preserve their own territories. The murmur this time carried a different tone. Anger. However, Admiral Torres continued, we are not bound by their strategic calculations. We have 127 ships that could reach the outer colonies before the Void Hunters arrive. I want to be clear about what we're discussing here. This would not be a rescue mission. This would be a combat operation against an enemy that has never been successfully engaged in the history of galactic civilization. She gestured to a holographic display showing the tactical situation. Our science teams have been analyzing Void Hunter behavior patterns and energy signatures for months. We believe we've identified potential vulnerabilities in their energy matrix. But I emphasize the word potential. This is largely theoretical. A hand shot up from the audience. What are our odds, Admiral? Torres didn't hesitate. Honestly, very low. We might save some lives, but the chances of our ships surviving the encounter are minimal. I estimate a 70 to 80% casualty rate among our forces. The room fell silent. These humans were being told that accepting this mission would likely mean their deaths, and they were considering it anyway. Another voice called out, Admiral, how many beings are we talking about saving? If we can buy enough time for additional evacuation ships to reach the colonies, we could potentially save an additional 800,000 to 1.2 million lives. More silence. I watched the faces around me, trying to understand what I was seeing. These weren't soldiers bred for war or fanatics driven by religious fervor. These were ordinary beings, traders, engineers, doctors, teachers, and they were genuinely debating whether to throw their lives away for the chance to save complete strangers. Finally, an older woman in the front row stood up. Admiral, I've got grandchildren back on Earth. I've also got a conscience. I can't live with myself if we have the chance to save 1 million lives, and we walk away because it's dangerous. A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd. More people stood, voicing their willingness to join what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission. "I'm in," called a young engineer. "Someone has to try." "Count me in too," said a transport pilot. Those people deserve a chance. Within minutes, nearly every human in the room had volunteered. They weren't being ordered to fight. They weren't being offered rewards or promises of glory. They were simply being given the opportunity to help, and they were taking it despite the cost. I found myself standing as well, though I wasn't sure why. As an observer, I was supposed to remain neutral, but something about the humans' determination had affected me deeply. After the assembly, I approached Admiral Torres. "May I ask you something?" She nodded. "Why are you doing this? Your own people will be safe regardless. You gain nothing from this fight, and you risk losing everything. It makes no logical sense." Torres was quiet for a moment, looking out at the stars through the station's viewing port. "You know, Zethka, I've studied the history of every major galactic civilization. All of them started with noble ideals. All of them ended up compromising those ideals when it became inconvenient to maintain them." She turned to face me. "Maybe we humans are naive. Maybe we don't understand how the galaxy really works. But we decided a long time ago that if becoming civilized means learning to ignore suffering when helping would be inconvenient, then we'd rather stay barbaric." That night, as I prepared my daily observation log, I struggled to find words to describe what I had witnessed. I had seen countless species make calculated decisions based on survival, profit, or strategic advantage. But I had never seen an entire civilization choose almost certain death for the sake of beings they had never met. The human fleet would launch in 36 hours. I had secured permission to accompany them as an observer, though several humans had tried to dissuade me from what they called unnecessary risk. They still didn't understand. This wasn't about documenting another military engagement. This was about witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that had apparently evolved past the basic survival instincts that governed every other form of intelligent life. As I watched the final preparations through my quarters viewport, I began to suspect that I was about to observe either the most glorious failure in galactic history, or something that would fundamentally change how the universe understood the nature of courage. Either way, I knew that after tomorrow, nothing would ever be the same. The human fleet launched exactly on schedule. 127 ships of various sizes and configurations, from massive dreadnoughts to small escort vessels. I was aboard the flagship Resilience with Admiral Torres and her command staff. As we entered hyperspace, I noticed something that struck me as uniquely human. Most military fleets I had observed maintained strict communication protocols during combat operations. Orders flowed down through rigid hierarchies, and personal communication was discouraged to maintain focus. But the humans were different. Medical team to engineering. "How's your daughter's recital preparation going?" came through the comm system. Engineering to medical. "She's nervous but excited. Thanks for asking. How's your new puppy?" They were treating this potentially final journey like a conversation between friends, which I realized it essentially was. These weren't professional soldiers following orders. They were neighbors, colleagues, and friends who had chosen to face death together. The journey to the outer colonies took 4 days in hyperspace. During that time, I had numerous conversations with the crew members, trying to understand their mindset. What I found was both simple and profound. My daughter asked me why I was going. Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos told me as we shared what humans called coffee in the ship's mess hall. I told her that sometimes grown-ups have to do scary things to protect people who can't protect themselves. "But these aren't your people," I pointed out. "You've never met them. They can't repay you for the sacrifice." Maria looked at me with genuine confusion. "Does that matter? They're people. They're in danger. We can help." That's enough. It was the same response I got from everyone I spoke with. Engineers, doctors, pilots, gunners. All of them seemed to share this incomprehensible belief that the suffering of strangers was somehow their responsibility. On the 3rd day of our journey, We received updated intelligence about the Void Hunters' approach. The news was worse than expected. Instead of a small hunting pack, the enemy was arriving in force. The energy signatures suggested at least 50 Void Hunter entities, possibly more. Admiral Torres called a senior staff meeting to discuss the revised tactical situation. I was permitted to observe as she laid out the new reality. The colonial evacuation is proceeding slower than hoped, she began. Equipment failures and overcrowding have reduced transport efficiency by 30%. At current rates, we're looking at 1.4 million beings still in the colonies when the Void Hunters arrive. The holographic display showed the stark numbers. 50 Void Hunters against 127 human ships. It was like watching someone plan to stop an avalanche with snowballs. Our original tactical plan assumed a smaller force, Torres continued. Against 50 entities, our survival probability drops to essentially zero. Our mission success probability is approximately 15%. The room was silent as everyone absorbed the implications. They had volunteered for a difficult mission that was now revealed to be nearly impossible. I want everyone to understand, Torres said, her voice steady, that I will order our retreat if anyone requests it. No one signed up to die uselessly. If we can't save those people, there's no point in throwing our lives away. I watched the faces around the room, expecting to see doubt, fear, or the beginnings of mutiny. Instead, I saw determination. Admiral, spoke Captain James Wright, commander of the escort squadron. With respect, I think you're underestimating us. 15% isn't 0%. Those are 1.4 million lives we're talking about. I take those odds for 15 people, much less 1.4 million. Heads nodded around the room. These humans had just learned that their mission had become exponentially more dangerous, and their response was to become more committed to it. There's something else, Torres added. Our science team has been running simulations based on the new energy readings. Dr. Chun, would you explain? Dr. Sarah Chun, the same woman who had welcomed me to human space, stepped forward. The Void Hunters appear to feed on fear and despair. The more terrified their victims become, the stronger the Void Hunters grow. It's a feedback loop that makes them nearly unstoppable once they begin feeding. She activated a new hologram showing energy flow patterns. However, our models suggest that beings who aren't afraid might actually disrupt their feeding process. If we could maintain high morale and low fear levels during the engagement, we might be able to weaken them significantly. I almost laughed out loud. They were suggesting that positive thinking could be used as a weapon against cosmic horrors that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia. It sounded like something from a children's story. But then I looked around the room again and realized something sobering. If any species in the galaxy could maintain morale while facing certain death, it would be humans. They had volunteered for this mission knowing it was likely suicide. They had doubled down when the odds got worse. Fear didn't seem to be a significant factor in their decision-making process. There's one more thing, Dr. Chin continued. The colonial populations are showing panic levels that will make them ideal feeding targets for the Void Hunters. But if they see ships arriving to help them, if they have reason for hope instead of despair, that could also disrupt the feeding process. Captain Wright leaned forward. So our job isn't just to fight the Void Hunters. It's to give those people something to believe in. Exactly. We need to be more than a military force. We need to be a symbol of hope. The meeting continued for another hour, with detailed tactical discussions about ship formations, communication protocols, and evacuation procedures. But the core of the plan remained beautifully simple. Arrive with enough courage and determination to inspire hope in the colonial populations while disrupting the Void Hunters' feeding mechanisms. It was insane. It was unprecedented. And somehow, I was beginning to believe it might actually work. On the fourth day, we dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the first colonial system. The scene that greeted us was one of barely controlled chaos. Evacuation ships were loading refugees as quickly as possible, while long-range sensors screamed warnings about approaching energy signatures. The Void Hunters were 6 hours out, and closing fast. Admiral Torres opened a channel to all ships in the system. "This is Admiral Elena Torres of a human fleet. We are here to assist with evacuation procedures and to engage the approaching hostile forces. All civilian vessels should continue evacuation operations. Do not attempt to engage the hostiles. We will handle them." The response from the colonial authorities was immediate and predictable. "Human ships, you are advised to retreat immediately. The approaching force cannot be engaged successfully. Do not waste your lives in a futile gesture." Torres replied calmly, "Acknowledge colonial command. We appreciate the warning, but we're staying. We have a job to do." I watched the tactical displays as the human ships moved into formation. They weren't positioning themselves for a fighting retreat or a strategic withdrawal. They were setting up to make a stand right there, in the path of the most feared predators in the galaxy. As the hours ticked by and the Void Hunter signatures grew stronger, something remarkable happened. The panic levels among the colonial populations began to drop. People who had been certain they were about to die started to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone was going to fight for them. The humans had given them hope. And hope, as we were about to learn, was a more powerful weapon than any technology in the galaxy. The Void Hunters arrived right on schedule, emerging from the dark between the stars like living nightmares given form. Through the ship's sensors, I could see them clearly for the first time. Writhing masses of dark energy that seemed to absorb light itself, growing larger and more terrible as they fed on the fear of their intended victims. But something was wrong. They weren't growing. The terror that should have been feeding them was being replaced by something else. The colonial populations weren't fleeing in blind panic anymore. They were watching their defenders with amazement and growing confidence. "All ships," Admiral Torres broadcast, "this is it. Remember, we're not just fighting for those people down there. We're fighting to prove that courage matters more than power, that doing what's right matters more than doing what's safe. Today, we show the galaxy what humanity really means." The Void Hunters seemed to sense that something was different. Their usual confident approach faltered as they encountered resistance they had never faced before, not just from weapons, but from the absolute refusal of their prey to submit to fear. As the first shots were fired, I realized I was about to witness something that would echo through galactic history. The humans weren't just fighting monsters. They were fighting the very concept that evil was inevitable, that the strong would always prey upon the weak, that courage was just a pretty word for foolishness. And for the first time in my long life, I found myself believing they might actually win. The battle began unlike anything I had ever witnessed in my thousands of years observing galactic conflicts. Typically, encounters with Void Hunters were brief, one-sided affairs. The entities would appear, feed on the terror of their victims, grow stronger with each moment of despair, and leave behind nothing but empty hulks of ships and dead worlds. Military engagement was considered pointless because fear made them stronger, and fear was the natural response to facing living darkness. But the humans had never read those tactical manuals. "All ships, weapons free," Admiral Torres commanded. "Target the leading entities, and remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves." The human fleet opened fire with a coordinated barrage that lit up the darkness of space. Energy beams, projectile weapons, and experimental technologies I had never seen before all focused on the approaching Void Hunters. What happened next defied thousands of years of military doctrine. The Void Hunters staggered. Not metaphorically, they actually recoiled from the assault as if they had been physically struck. The dark energy that composed their forms flickered and wavered where the human weapon struck them. "Direct hit on Entity Alpha 7. Reported Lieutenant Santos from the tactical station. Energy readings show a 15% reduction in cohesion. Confirm, DR. Chen's voice came through the comm from the science station. The entity is actually weakening instead of growing stronger. The lack of fear response from our crews is disrupting their feeding patterns." I looked around the bridge of the resilience, trying to understand what I was seeing. In any normal military situation, Facing the Void Hunters would have resulted in immediate panic. Instead, the human crew was working with calm efficiency, calling out tactical updates, and adjusting their firing patterns as if they were conducting a training exercise. More remarkably, I could hear similar reports from other ships in the fleet. Engineers were rerouting power to weapons with steady voices. Gunners were tracking targets and reporting successful hits without a trace of fear in their communications. Even junior crew members were performing their duties with the kind of composure that usually took decades of combat experience to develop. It shouldn't have been possible. These humans weren't emotionless machines or battle-hardened veterans. They were ordinary people who had volunteered for a mission they knew would probably kill them. Yet they faced cosmic horrors with the same calm determination they might bring to any difficult job. Entity Beta 3 is breaking formation, reported Captain Wright from the escort squadron. It's trying to reach the civilian evacuation ships. Negative. Torres responded immediately. Echo Squadron, intercept. Do not let it through. I watched through the tactical display as 12 human ships changed course to block a Void Hunter that was easily 10 times their combined mass. They positioned themselves between the entity and the fleeing civilian transports without hesitation. The Void Hunter struck the first ship, a small corvette called Defiant Hope. The energy feedback should have torn the vessel apart instantly. Instead, the ship's shields held for nearly 30 seconds while the crew continued firing point-blank into the entity's core. "This is Commander Rodriguez on the Hope," came the calm voice over the comm. "We're taking heavy damage but maintaining fire. The entity is definitely weakening. Keep hitting it." The Hope finally succumbed to the assault, but by then, the other ships had concentrated their fire on the entity. Instead of growing stronger from the destruction it had caused, the Void Hunter seemed to be unraveling. The crew of the Hope had died, but they had died without fear, without despair, and their sacrifice was actively weakening their killer. All ships confirm, when our people die without fear, it's disrupting the entity's ability to feed, Dr. Chen announced. Courage is literally poisoning them. That statement should have sounded ridiculous. Instead, it explained everything I was witnessing. The Void Hunters had evolved to feed on terror and despair. They had grown powerful over millennia because every species that encountered them responded with exactly the emotions that made them stronger. But humans were apparently capable of something unprecedented, dying well. The battle raged for 3 hours. Human ships were destroyed one by one, but each loss weakened the Void Hunters instead of strengthening them. More importantly, the colonial populations watching from their evacuation ships weren't seeing a massacre. They were seeing a miracle. Colonial Transport Delta 9 reporting came a voice I didn't recognize. "We've completed evacuation of Sector 7. The refugees are asking if they can help somehow. They want to do something for the people fighting for them." "Tell them they're already helping," Torres replied. "Their hope is our best weapon." And it was true. As news of the battle spread through the evacuation fleet, something remarkable happened. Instead of the terror that usually fed Void Hunters during an attack, the refugees were feeling gratitude, admiration, and hope. They were witnessing beings willingly sacrifice themselves for strangers, and it was transforming their understanding of what was possible. The Void Hunters, meanwhile, were starving. They had arrived expecting a feast of fear and despair. Instead, they were encountering something they had never faced before, a species that genuinely valued the lives of others more than their own safety. Entity Alpha 1 is showing critical degradation, reported Dr. Chun. Its energy matrix is becoming unstable. Through the viewports, I could see what she meant. The largest Void Hunter, which had been a writhing mass of darkness when it arrived, was now flickering like a dying flame. Instead of growing stronger as it fed on destruction, it was consuming itself, trying to process the paradox of beings who faced death with joy because they were saving others. By the 4th hour, only 47 human ships remained operational. But the Void Hunter force had been reduced from 50 entities to fewer than 20, and Those remaining were visibly weakened. "Admiral," came a voice from one of the surviving escort ships. "We're reading massive energy buildup from the remaining entities. They're trying to merge into a single construct." Torres studied the tactical display. "They're desperate. They know they can't feed normally, so they're trying to combine their remaining power into one final attack." The remaining Void Hunters began swirling together, their dark energies merging into something that defied description. It was like watching the birth of a black hole, if black holes could hate and hunger and rage against the very concept of hope. "All ships," Torres announced. "This is their last play. They're putting everything into one attack. If we can survive this and keep fighting back, we'll have won something nobody thought was possible." The merged entity was massive, easily dwarfing any ship in the human fleet. It gathered itself for what was clearly intended to be a killing blow against the remaining defenders. But something else was happening. Throughout the evacuation fleet, on every transport ship and rescue vessel, beings from a dozen different species were watching the battle. They had seen humans sacrifice themselves without hesitation to save complete strangers. They had witnessed courage that transcended species, politics, and self-interest. And they were no longer afraid. Instead of the terror that had fed Void Hunters for millennia, the merged entity found itself facing something unprecedented, an entire population that refused to despair even in the face of cosmic horror, because they had seen proof that goodness was real and worth fighting for. The entity struck the human fleet with everything it had. Ships exploded. Brave crews died in an instant of searing energy. But when the light faded, Admiral Torres was still there, still broadcasting on all frequencies. "This is the human fleet. We're still here. We're still fighting. And we're going to keep fighting until every last person is safe." The merged Void Hunter entity flickered, wavered, and began to collapse in on itself. It had expended everything it had and gained nothing in return. Worse, it was actively being weakened by the hope and courage surrounding it. For the first time in galactic history, the Void Hunters were retreating, not because they had completed their feeding, but because they were starving in the presence of beings who refused to give them what they needed to survive. As I watched the dark entities flee back into the void between stars, I realized that I had just witnessed the most important moment in galactic history. The humans hadn't just won a battle. They had proven that courage and selflessness weren't just noble ideals. They were actual weapons against the darkest forces in the universe. And every being in the galaxy was about to learn what that meant for the future of civilization itself. In the aftermath of the battle, as rescue ships moved through the debris field searching for survivors, I found myself struggling to process what I had witnessed. 19 human ships had survived the encounter. 19 out of 127. By any military calculation, it was a devastating loss. But 1.4 million beings were alive who should have been dead. The Void Hunters had retreated for the first time in recorded galactic history. And the survivors weren't mourning their losses. They were celebrating their victory. "We did it," Admiral Torres said simply as she stood in the Resilience's damaged bridge, looking out at the evacuation fleet. Every single transport made it out safely. The communications board was lighting up with messages from across the galaxy. Word of the battle was spreading at the speed of light through every known communication network. The impossible had happened, and everyone wanted to know how. I had been sending regular reports throughout the engagement, but now I found myself needing to write something unprecedented, a description of the first successful military action against Void Hunters in galactic history. My first priority, however, was interviewing the survivors while their experiences were fresh. What I learned continued to challenge everything I thought I understood about the nature of sentient behavior. "Were you afraid?" I asked Commander Lisa Park, whose destroyer had been one of the first ships to engage the merged entity. She considered the question seriously before answering. "Terrified. Of course I was terrified. But being afraid and giving up aren't the same thing. Those people needed us to succeed, so failure wasn't an option. But you knew you were probably going to die." Probably yes, but probably isn't certainly. And even if it had been certainly, those lives were worth the risk. It was the same answer I got from every survivor. They had been afraid, but they had fought anyway because someone needed them to fight. They valued the lives of strangers more than their own safety. It was a concept so alien to standard galactic psychology that I had trouble finding words to describe it. 3 days after the battle, we received an unexpected visitor. A Visian Empire battlecruiser dropped out of hyperspace and requested permission to come alongside. Admiral Torres granted the request, though I noticed the human ships maintained defensive formations just in case. The Visian delegation was led by War Premier Kaltos himself, one of the most senior military commanders in the Empire. He was a massive being, even by the Cien standards, with the ceremonial scars that marked him as a veteran of dozens of campaigns. "I come to understand," he said without preamble when he met with Admiral Torres in the Resilience's conference room. "My species has fought for 10,000 years. We have conquered systems and crushed empires. But we have never defeated Void Hunters." Torres offered him a seat, which he accepted stiffly. "What do you wish to know, War Premier? How did you overcome the fear? In every simulation my strategists run, the terror response makes Void Hunters stronger. How did your warriors fight without fear?" "We didn't," Torres replied. "We were afraid. But we fought anyway." Kaltos stared at her for long moments. "This makes no sense. Fear weakens warriors. It makes them hesitate, makes them flee. How can you fight effectively while experiencing fear?" "Fear doesn't have to control you," Torres explained. "It can inform you that something is dangerous, but you can still choose to face that danger if the cause is important enough." I watched the War Premier struggle with this concept. In the Cien culture, as in most galactic civilizations, fear was seen as something to be eliminated or overcome. The idea that you could acknowledge fear and still act courageously was foreign to their thinking. "The beings you saved," Kaltos continued, "they were not your people. They owed you nothing. You gained no territory, no resources, no strategic advantage. Why did you accept such losses for no benefit?" "Saving 1.4 million lives isn't no benefit," Torres replied. "That's the greatest benefit we could possibly achieve." The War Premier fell silent again. Finally, he spoke. "I have studied the battle recordings. Your warriors died with honor. They died protecting others. In the Cien culture, we would build monuments to such heroes." "Then build monuments," Torres said quietly. "But more importantly, remember why they fought. Remember that strength isn't just about conquering others. Sometimes it's about protecting them." Over the following weeks, delegations arrived from across the galaxy. The Machine Collective sent analytical teams to study human tactical innovations. The Psionic Consortium dispatched researchers to investigate the mental discipline that allowed humans to function despite fear. Even isolated species that rarely participated in galactic affairs sent representatives to learn about the beings who had achieved the impossible. But the most significant response came from the civilian populations throughout the galaxy. The story of the battle spread beyond official channels, carried by traders, refugees, and wanderers who had heard about beings willing to die for strangers. On worlds where people had given up hope of protection from their own governments, they began asking why their leaders couldn't be more like the humans. In sectors where the strong preyed on the weak without consequence, voices began demanding change. The humans, meanwhile, were dealing with their newfound fame in typically human fashion. When offered territorial concessions by grateful colonial governments, they politely declined and suggested the resources be used to improve medical and educational facilities instead. When the Galactic Trade Consortium offered them exclusive trading rights worth billions of credits, they requested that the benefits be shared equally among all species in the affected trade routes. When military alliances offered them advanced weapons technology, they accepted only on the condition that they could share it freely with any species facing Void Hunter threats. "They're still doing it," I noted to Admiral Torres during my final interview session. "Even after proving they're the most formidable military force in the galaxy, They're still putting everyone else's interests ahead of their own. Torres smiled. That's not going to change, Zethka. That's who we are. But why? You've earned the right to demand whatever you want. Every species in the galaxy owes you a debt they can never repay. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the stars. You know what the first human spacefarer said when he stepped onto an alien world? I shook my head. We come in peace for all mankind. Not for Earth. Not for humanity. For all mankind. From the very beginning, we understood that if we were going to travel to the stars, we had a responsibility to make the galaxy better for everyone, not just ourselves. As I prepared to leave human space and return to my wandering, I realized that my role as a galactic observer had fundamentally changed. For thousands of years, I had documented the rise and fall of civilizations, the endless cycles of conquest and collapse that seemed to define intelligent life. But the humans had broken that cycle. They had proven that courage was stronger than fear, that cooperation was more powerful than conquest, and that sometimes the greatest strength came from being willing to sacrifice for others. My final report to the Galactic Archive contained a statement I had never expected to write. The human species represents a fundamental evolution in galactic civilization. They have demonstrated capabilities that suggest the possibility of a post-conflict galactic society based on mutual aid rather than mutual exploitation. The response from my superiors was immediate and predictable. Observer Zethka, please verify your mental health status. Your latest report contains conclusions that appear to be influenced by extended exposure to anomalous psychological phenomena. But I knew what I'd seen. I had watched beings choose death over dishonor, sacrifice over safety, hope over despair. I had witnessed the birth of something new in the galaxy, something that would change the course of history. 6 months later, when the Void Hunters returned in greater numbers to test whether the human victory had been a fluke, they found something unexpected waiting for them. They didn't just face 200 human ships this time. They faced a coalition of 12 species, all trained in human tactics, all committed to the radical idea that courage and cooperation could overcome fear and predation. The Void Hunters lasted less than 2 hours before retreating again. Today, 3 years after that first battle, Void Hunter attacks have decreased by over 90%. Piracy rates have dropped across all major trade routes. Refugee camps have been replaced by integration centers where displaced populations are helped rather than merely warehoused. The galaxy is becoming a better place, and it started with beings who believed that doing the right thing was more important than surviving to do the convenient thing. I have seen empires rise and fall, witness the birth and death of stars, and observe the evolution of countless species. But nothing in my long existence has been as remarkable as watching humans teach the galaxy how to be brave. They charged into battle against impossible odds, not because they were fearless, but because they had something worth being afraid for. And in doing so, they proved that the stars need never fear the darkness again, as long as there are beings willing to carry light into the void. That is the true story of humanity's place in the galactic community. They didn't conquer us. They inspired us. They showed us that civilization isn't about being strong enough to survive, but about being brave enough to help others survive. And that perhaps is the most human lesson of all.